I have also.
I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to introduce the case which stands in his name for which not to exceed.
Nice tie. I can't see it. Don't show the pot.
Madam Speaker, there is a researcher at Cambridge named Aubrey de Grey, and he claims that medical science through advancement is getting close to curing or meaningfully delaying the process of aging. He claims that this is going to extend life past the arbitrary age of like plus minus 100. People are still going to be able to live functionally within society, although they can be killed by unnatural causes like disease and car accidents. But we're meaningfully, potentially going to extend the human lifespan at more than 100, and we'd like to principally oppose this on our side of the house. We think we stand for there being a difference between improving quality of life and naturally extending this, so this house would principally oppose all efforts to naturally extend the human lifespan. We think we could talk to you today about all the practical problems that would be associated with this, like overpopulation, the stretching of resources, but we don't think that's good enough to hang our hat on the end of the day. We'd like to approach this to you from a philosophical standpoint, and I'm going to talk to you about three things in doing so. The first thing I'd like to talk to you about is death as a motivational tool. We think a large part of your motivation as a member in society to succeed, to accomplish something for yourself, even to create a legacy, is the fact that you know you're working within a limited time frame. I think the analogy that I could draw is you finding out that you have an essay due in a week or an essay due in a year. We still think you'd probably put the same amount of work into that essay over that time frame, but in working in the week, the proportion of your efficiency would be much, much higher. And we think this is a very good thing. We think you work harder, given a limited time frame, than an extended one. We think part of this is that life has formative periods with expectations that are associated chronologically towards it. So for example, arbitrarily around 30, the common expectation is that maybe you would start to seek a permanent job of some kind. We think meaningfully people do build their careers, or at least interested in building their careers, around the age of 30. We think those expectations come within working within a limited time frame, and I'm not going to regret that. We also think that this drive to succeed is a uniquely youthful phenomenon. We think people who are younger are much more idealistic and willing to try new things and to innovate than people who are generally older in society because they're less cynical and less jaded by the process. I was much more idealistic coming into my first year of undergraduate than I am coming out of my fourth. And I think an analogy can be drawn in accomplishments in my earlier life rather than my later life. And we think that essentially we're bold enough to claim that if the human lifespan was naturally around 50 years, that more would be accomplished, and we'd have more efficiency associated with that process. But you disagree.
Wouldn't, after having 150 years to decide our careers, we make good decisions that are well informed about what we want to do with our lives, as opposed to all becoming lawyers?
So, good point. So I think there's other things associated with that process, though, right? I think in working with a limited time frame, you actually have to prioritize decisions over another into what is more important to you as an individual, and in some cases, what's more important to society. And I'm going to get to that later in my analysis. So the second thing I'd like to talk to you about is this societal point, in compromising altruism, and how this is going to do that. We think people living longer are less likely to look to others and look to their own needs instead. We think parents often tend to live vicariously through their children because of the proportion of the life they've lived in comparison. Let me provide to you this analogy. You're 40 years old, and your child is 10. Meaningfully, you're approaching the middle of your lifespan, and your child has only lived about 10% of theirs. That makes you much more willing to invest money into their university education because they have so much potential than your yacht, because your potential at that age is still very much limited. We think passing that down to the younger generation, if you buy my analysis, is a very good thing. We also think that when you're dying, or when you know that your life is coming to a close, there are much more meaningful things associated with that benefit society. We think people who know that their life is coming to an end are much more likely to repair long-standing grievances. We think they're much likely to seek reconciliation. and we want to facilitate that process as much as possible. We also think, in benefiting society, individuals will often make a calculus in regards to the proportion of life they have left. Someone who's only able to live for 100 years is much more likely to care about something arbitrary, like fighting for freedom, an abstract contrast that is going to impact them much more meaningfully in a limited time frame than if they can just wait that out and see. I think that we actually promote ideals like fighting for freedom and doing these kind of idealistic things when you know you operate within a limited time frame. I think that's good as well. The third thing I'd like to talk to you about, though, and I think the most important and relevant in this round, is death as a mechanism for social change. So as much as my grandparents have been socialized for a long, long time, my grandmother is still racist, right? Like, she just is at the end of the day. Meaningfully, that socialization process hasn't been able to take its toll because she had a lot of values entrenched in her at a younger age. And we think when, in our generation, we've been socialized from birth to try and ignore things like racism in our society, we get to eliminate those things by having the people in my grandmother's generation and your grandparents' generation move on from this world. We think that's how social changes really come about in this scenario. And we think that happens in society, but we also think that happens on a political level as well. I'll expand on that in a minute. Sean.
Okay, so I read the same cracked article as you, but you need to show why it is ethically permissible for the government to rely on people dying as a means of advancing its objectives.
So you didn't watch the same TED Talk as me. And I think the government is absolutely, it has interests in progress and social change. I think the government can't predict what the values of my children and your children are going to be, and we need to let them forge their own path in this scenario. I think we would make meaningful strides towards overcoming homophobia when a more homophobic generation passes on and our children are more socialized into that kind of acceptance. You can't create that same scenario later in life along with the grandparent analogy. So we think, Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, a lot of the angst involving death comes from this idea of not living up to your potential, right? That you somehow missed it. When you die in a car accident, you grieve your loved one because they had so much more they could accomplish. But we don't think this is the scenario at the end of the day here. Everyone in this room knows that the sum of the game is around plus minus 100 if nothing goes wrong. And they operate within that time frame, so they're able to make meaningful decisions and prioritize what they want to accomplish. So we don't think the angst would be involved here in simply not extending the human lifespan. We principally oppose this. We think it's
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his speech. I'd now like to invite the member of the opposition to introduce the case for side opposition today in a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Here, here.
Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. We're going to stand today on the side, I guess, of immortality. So what we think meaningfully is that if you have the opportunity to really extend your lifespan like this, it is a beneficial thing. There's all sorts of better things you can do. We get rid of a lot of negative aspects of today's society. We're proud to stand for it. I have 3 constructive points here today. My first is just a utilitarian analysis of like the benefits of living longer. My second is about protection against mistakes. And my third one is about not giving up on old people. Seriously, it's important, I promise. So my first utilitarian point. What Sean and I would put to you, Madam Speaker, is that long enough life, even at a basic level, and I think like it's pretty clear in this round that like you can actualize in that time, you do like have a meaningful life, you can. A longer life is a good enough reason to oppose this motion. Just on the face of it, we think that having a longer period to live, given that like that's what people want, given the angst that they acknowledge that's associated with death, we think that's beneficial. We think having a longer time to like make those choices, to live, to experience variety, is fundamentally a good thing. My second constructive point is going to go into that a little more. Protection against mistakes. So like Sean makes the funny point about all becoming lawyers. But I think fundamentally a lot of people in society, and this happens all the time, feel that if they've screwed up, they've wasted life. That is, if they make a choice that they are not happy with in hindsight, you don't have the opportunity to go back on it. You don't have the opportunity to actualize further, and it meaningfully prevents you from living the kind of life that you want to live. So I'll give you an example. If you come out of undergrad, you don't know what you want to do, you go and you become a lawyer, and later on you're 40 and you hate it, there is really nothing you can do, or at the very least, you feel as though there's nothing you can do. And I think that meaningfully inhibits your life. I see Louis shaking his head depressingly. Sorry. You feel as though there's no way you can change it. So on our side of the house, what do we get? We have that 40-year-old lawyer who knows that he's not at a certain point in the trajectory of his life. We have that 40-year-old lawyer who is not depressed at his future prospects, given that he cannot, he feels, and he really can't choose to change them in any real way. Yes?
Don't we want to incentivize better decision making? Like, think harder about becoming a lawyer rather than doing it again later?
So, you want to incentivize it by, like, maintaining the status quo, then you're admitting that, like, these problems do happen all the time. You're not offering greater incentive, you're keeping the status quo, first of all. And secondly, I think it's important that, like, you're never going to totally get rid of mistakes. People can perfectly, like, plan and know what it's going to be like at the age of 22. You're always going to have those mistakes happening. On our side of the house, the consequence doesn't exist. But moreover, I think you get a broad benefit at your future stuff, and in terms of, like, how you feel later on. If you have experienced variety, you have, you feel that you've made the best decision, you've experienced what options are out there for you, I think that's a fundamental reason to stand on our side of the house. You have people who gain expertise in other positions, but if they don't like them, they can go gain that expertise again. It's not as though if you wait until 30 to get a job, no one's going to hire you because they wonder why you're not working at 30. We think that you get rid of all of these problems on our side of the house, you allow people to make better decisions, and you get rid of all this huge group of people who feel depressed, who feel terrible about the choices that they've made, given that their past is behind them, they have a limited amount of future before them, and that's fundamentally harmful for their mind, for their experiences, and for their ability to gain utility. Thirdly, I think not giving up on old people. Now, this is going to laugh originally, but I think this is actually a really good point, because when you retire, Madam Speaker, you are in essence ignored, you are given up upon, you are to some extent considered dead weight. The government, like, you can still do things, the government, like, gives you some resources, but fundamentally, they are waiting for you, like, to die. You are, like, in a position where you're no longer, like, adding to society in any meaningful way. We think that's, like, psychologically harmful to be in that position where you feel as though, like, everything is behind you, and you have that, like, 15-year period at the end of your life where, like, it seems meaningless. And we think, like, at the point at which, when like death occurs, when these problems happen, it doesn't happen in that way where you have to experience that, like, depressing end of being given up upon. That is broadly better. That allows the government to make better decisions regarding people of all ages, so you don't feel and be given up upon past a certain point. So I'm going to get into now what we heard from Ryan. So first of all, I think the principal, like, bulk of what we heard is about, like, motivation to succeed. He spends a lot of his speech on that. So, like, a couple points. He says there's a motivation to succeed, like, when death is in place. I think I've sort of already covered this with my second point, in that, like, you get depressed and no longer have that motivation to succeed if you don't feel you've made the right decision. But I have a couple other responses as well. So firstly, like, I think a lot of people perceive, like, their interaction with death, like, in their head as an interaction with meaninglessness, as like, if I'm going to die eventually, of what meaning is this now? And I think at least as much as if you believe what he says about it motivating you, I think in at least as many cases it is actually, like, stopping people from wanting to do things because they conceive the meaninglessness of their future, given they, like, won't be around to experience their legacy in a lot of ways. We think that's really important on our side of the house. But further, indefinitely living a life full of pleasure, full of an ability to, like, maximize your utility is actually, I think, like, a motivation in itself to succeed. In that, like, if you succeed now, you have a much longer period of time to, like, reap the benefits of your success, reap the benefits of your knowledge. I think knowing that it's not going to be of that extremely limited value, and that the value of like, being motivated and doing these things is actually greater, given the longer period of time you have to, like, reap the benefits and, like, be satisfied, I think that is a big motivation in and of itself. And furthermore, I think that people are going to actually make better decisions, given that they feel less pressure to make those decisions at a given time. They feel able to wait to make, like, permanent or semi-permanent decisions up to a point where they feel comfortable doing it, given that they're no longer stuck on this, like, extremely limited trajectory of what life is. They don't feel they have to decide everything at 25, or it's not going to matter anyway. I think that's a reason that he's wrong in that point. And then also the less motivation to stick with bad choices that I think I covered adequately in my second point also applies here. So he talks about compromising altruism and how you're more likely to seek reconciliation on their side of the house. Like, first of all, like, I think, like, seeking reconciliation at the end of your life, like, isn't the biggest deal in the round. I don't think that, like, really sways you towards, like, not becoming immortal to like, actualize forever. But secondly, I think you make those choices simply because death exists, and their value is in terms of comforting you on the brink of death. So, like, the value of, like, reconciling with old enemies is such that you don't want to die without having done so. I think he needs to, like, prove the actual value of that in terms of an indefinite lifespan. So I think, Madam Speaker, because living your life for a long period of time is actually like a better period with which you can actualize, and that's better on the side of the house. I think because you protect against mistakes and stop the depression of making a wrong decision that you cannot go back on. I think because you don't have that period at the end of your life whereby you feel and are given up upon. These are all reasons to support immortality. We oppose. Thank you.
Thank the Emma for his speech. I'd now like to introduce the Minister of the Crown to conclude the constructive case for side government today in a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Here, here.
Alright, I just want to preface this with the disclaimer that none of what Ryan and I say is a personal attack on anyone against the judging panel. At all, whatsoever. Do not take it in that manner. There are arguments made. Okay, so that's like MC style. I'm going to repeat what John just said and then rebuild the sort of reputation of my mind. Okay, so his first point was utilitarian, right? And I think it's sort of like telling that he only spent like 30 seconds on it. He basically just asserted that on face value, he'd like to have like people living longer lifespans because it's just better somehow, right? Like I think the brunt of what he wanted to say was just like, if we extended lifetime, people would live happier lives for longer, therefore it's better. Utilitarian, right? I think just in general, we would ask him to sort of justify that deeper, but we would want that. What Ryan and I say constructively against that is that I think it's sort of like a ceiling versus floor concept, right? In that we think in terms of for individuals who have good lives, sort of idyllic lives, we think the extension from 100 years old natural lifespan to a 400 years natural lifespan necessarily improves the quality of their life that much more, right? We don't think if you already have a good life, right? Like we don't think living that extra 300 years really tangibly improves your life to that extent. And I think Ryan gave you a lot of good analysis when he talked about like, you will just flat out accomplish things less efficiently, right? You will be less motivated to accomplish better things, right? So an example, I'll give you two examples, right? One is Ogedai Khan, like Genghis Khan's son, who like conquered half the world. Second is Cecil Rhodes, who like was a really stellar example of the British Empire's awesomeness, right? Both of those individuals knew at the age of 14 or 16 that they were going to die at the age of 30 or around then, right? They devoted the rest of their short lifespan to creating empires the likes of which the world had never seen before, right? That powerful death as a motivator really incentivized them to push forward in ways and advance human knowledge and society in ways that like, we don't think we would have if they had thought they had 400 years left to do so, right? So I think for individuals who have like basic good lives, we don't think the addition of this, sort of extended lifetime really helps them. We think there is a maximum ceiling at which human happiness can reach, regardless of how long you really truly live, because of all the motivational and efficiency aspects that Ryan gave you. What we think, though, is that there is the potential for a floor if your life kind of sucks, right? If you are in sort of an impoverished circle where you have like you're suffering from PTSD and your lifespan instead of dying naturally at 90, you now die naturally at 300, you actually kind of suffer a lot longer, right? We think that's sort of the floor ceiling concept in that for individuals who are suffering, living longer makes their life worse. For individuals who aren't suffering, we don't think you really tangibly improve their lives all of that much. We think that takes time to show that. I'll take one of you.
Okay, so if having PTSD is so bad, why aren't you prescribing people commit suicide now and end it as soon as possible?
We kind of oppose suicide. I don't think we need to really justify that. We just think like extending the lifespan would just make their lives tangibly worse. Right? We essentially our stance here is like we don't think this helps in the way that you think it helps, and we need to really deeply establish why just living an extra few years tangibly increases your life that much more in regards to our construction. The second point is sort of protection against mistakes and career mistakes. What we want to say to this finance speaker is this, right? We think one of the reasons midlife crisis come about is precisely because individuals realize they only have a few short years or decades left to live, right? Midlife crisis come about because you realize you have been wasting your life and you only have 50% of that life left to live. We think that's precisely that motivator that incentivizes individuals to reflect back upon their life and realize maybe they've been doing something wrong, maybe they want to do another career they prefer more, and actually change and do that, and we think that has a lot of good societal benefits. As a lot of Ryan's analysis said, we think if that lifespan is then extended to 400 years old, we don't think you have that same necessary pressure for midlife crisis, right? We think individuals are more complacent, grow more complacent, are willing to wait out longer decades in bad careers because they think they have that time. They think they have that 150 years with which to try and decide, right? We want to further add in sort of a lot of lines of reputation matters speaker is is this, right? Is that like we think as opposed to being okay with more technically good job, we think there's sort of like a relative progression, like proportional to lifespan, right? So an example I'll give is like previous like ages ago, right? In like you only really required an elementary degree, and then you went off to work in a factory because lifespan was shorter, right? In this day and age, pretty much you need a bachelor's of arts in order to function in like most jobs in society, right? And like as we think we extend the human lifespan to like 400 years, we think you then proportionally acquire a longer time of choosing, longer time of hesitation, longer time of soul searching in terms of your academic degree to find that perfect job for you, right? We then require exactly what Sean's POI would be, right? We think we would live in a world where you wait until you're 150 years old instead of 20 years old to choose what career you want. We think that actually plays perfectly into Ryan's analysis about inefficiency in that sort of society, right? You then wait 150 years instead of choosing and making priorities and choosing what actually you think like in priority sense makes you the most happy within a 20-year lifespan, being much more efficient. We reject that. His last point was not giving up on old people, right? Okay, so here's what we'd say. We don't really define dead weight as just you being older, right? In that, like we think obviously like old people can have very large contributions to society. In fact, usually because they know they don't have that much longer to live and they want to give back as much as possible, they want to do as much as possible and accomplish as much as possible and be as happy as possible, right? The problem is what we would define dead weight as is when you're like essentially holding back the rest of societal progression. In fact, I think that's what dead weight means. Like you're sort of dragging back the rest of the pack, right? And that's all the analysis that Ryan gave you about why this would be the case, right? We think like this is why like the impetus for social change comes when sort of the people who oppose it, the less progressive older people pass on and die off, right? We think, so an example I'll give for this, we think like if in this new society scenario, you have a dilution of the power of new ideas, right? And that as you have more and more old people remaining alive in society, each newer generation who has new ideas, better social, more progressive social ideas, the power of those ideas are diluted by all of the older individuals who have set mindsets and are stubborn mindsets and are still remaining alive. We think that's why in the natural cycle of life, like as equal numbers of individuals die and equal number of individuals are born, that's why you have social change, because those ideas, the power of those ideas aren't diluted by an ever-increasing number of individuals who remain alive. Okay, onto some, like, I guess, rebuilding, right? I don't think they really attack the main death as a motivator stance, right? I think that's what they crucially need to win on their side of things and have a chance of winning this round, right? I think they need to prove why having a longer lifespan doesn't dilute the motivation you have to create better things for society. And I don't think he gave us a lot of analysis as to why, like, just improving, like, extending the lifetime necessarily increases in quality of life in any tangible way, shape, or form. I don't think he also dealt with sort of the altruism, right? He talked a lot about reaping benefits, and I think that really plays into our side of the house, Madam Speaker, right? We think if you live longer, you're more incentivized to reap those benefits for yourself. We think that plays it directly to Ryan's analysis that you have less altruism, right? You have less of a need to give to your children, you have less of a need to give to others in society because you want to keep those benefits to yourself because you know you're going to live longer, you want those resources near towards the end of your life, right? We think that decreases the level of altruism in society in all those myriad of ways that Ryan talked about that I don't think they dealt with adequately in their side of the house. And I don't think they even dealt with our sort of social change at all, other than to say that we want to be nice to old people. And I think I refuted that adequately. So for all of those reasons, Madam Speaker, we are incredibly proud to be close here today.
I'd like to thank the Minister of the Crown for his speech, and I'd like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to conclude the case for side opposition today. Here, here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The existentialist philosopher Albert Camus said that ultimately the most important question we will ever ask ourselves is, why don't you just kill yourself? Why does life have meaning? And I think, like Camus, we are going to come up with the answer that regardless of how much time we have here, the fact that we can achieve things, us as mere material beings whose consciousness is the result of some neurological science, we'd say that that is meaningful and ought to be preserved to its fullest capacity. I'm going to talk about three themes in the round. I'm going to talk about how people will see their lives, I'm going to talk about what an individual life will be like, and finally I'm going to talk about how this will affect society. So, how do people see their lives? And I think ultimately the most important question here that's been thrown around on both sides of the round is this notion of existential angst. And like, existentialism came about in full force at the beginning of the 20th century as a result of a number of philosophers taking a critical reevaluation of the evidence for God and heaven and finding that the evidence to them came up short. And in the absence of a heaven where you will go for the rest of your life, for an eternal life afterwards, it seems the finite nature of our life deprives us of all meaning. And existentialist philosophers have spent the last 70 years struggling to try and give us an answer, because it seems, both to an existentialist philosopher and to us, ordinary people, that the fact that that ultimately we will come to nothing means that it seems like life is meaningless. That the fact that there is a hard cap on how long we can live truly means that the things we accomplish will be blown away by the sands of time. The problem that has plagued humanity and has plagued these people, these thinkers, who have devoted incredible intellectual resources for the last 100 years to it, is the fact that we do not get some unlimited chance to enjoy our lives, that we do not get that heaven. What side government is telling you is that when the chance to achieve that heaven comes about, when the chance to resolve that comes about, we should deny it. We have two huge problems with this under the field of existential angst. Firstly, that the reason people value heaven so much, and the reason that the lack of its possibility that people started to, like atheism came into vogue in the 20th century, the reason it was such a problem was because this idea of an indefinite life had now escaped them. We'd say, when we finally have a chance for that problem to go away, that is a good thing. But we'd moreover say that even if at some philosophical level that's not true, existential angst is something that we all experience in our daily lives as well. That we are always worried day in and day out that it doesn't mean anything. That it is not just the teenagers listening to Simple Plan who think that in the end a life has no meaning, but that we all are concerned about the fact that what we do here on Earth may not actually matter all that much, because there is a point, and the reason that we think that our actions don't matter isn't because they don't have consequences, but because they're going to come to an end, and there is a point at which we will no longer be able to actualize on them. We'd say, if you take away that source of existential angst, you remove the one most negative thing to how people view their lives. Go ahead.
Okay, we think the knowledge that your life is finite is what gives, for instance, freedom fighters, as Ryan said, in Libya, the courage to actually fight for a greater ideal like freedom at the cost of their own lives.
Okay, I'm going to deal with the utilitarian, like the actual material effects in my next question. I would just broadly say that that doesn't change the fact that existential angst as a, we'd say that, if anything, the material consequences of that as a preview are that you're more likely to throw away your life on those sorts of things. You're less likely to preserve it. We'd say that those sorts of decisions are often rash and ill-informed. So I'd like to move on to the second point of what will lives actually be like. The first thing I would like to point out is that, the average human life and what the average day spent in a human life is like gets better and better as time goes on. At the end of the day, I want you to think about what life was like 200 years ago, and think of all the leaps and bounds in what we have today. The fact that your food will not go bad if you leave it for 2 hours is actually a really good thing. We'd say that, if you look at the rate of change we've made in the last 200 years compared to the 2000 before it, the other thing that we get is that society is advancing faster and faster and faster in the sorts of scientific developments we make. We'd say that the chance to experience all of those developments and the way in which life is going to get better is meaningfully important, and I'll take you in a moment. We'd say that the fact that in the future we will cure not just cancer, but also hunger and pain and blue balls actually makes people's lives better. And I think people ought to choose to be around to experience that. Yes?
Okay, quality of life improvements, like learning to wash your hands, have nothing to do with extending your lifespan. The two just aren't related.
No, what my point is that by choosing to extend your lifespan, you will get to enjoy the quality of life improvements that will be coming in the future. You have completely misunderstood. Please respond in a PMR. And we'd say that in addition to just curing our basic impediments, there are other experiences of great worth that we can't even imagine. That, if you choose to continue your life indefinitely, if you wisely plug your ears to what Queens is telling you, you will get to do things like travel to the edge of space and stare into nothingness. We'd say that whether that experience is good or bad, it is meaningfully important at an aesthetic level, and people should have the opportunity to choose to see whether they want that level of contemplation. Side government would deny you that. But we'd also say that just at a level of pure utility, and Wudi said that this point of ours was rather trivial, but it's not. It is basically that by living longer, you have more chances to be happy. We'd say the fact that people don't kill themselves now is evidence of the fact that, generally speaking, it is better to continue living, that each day you add onto your life is more utility. It's the principle of aggregation across time for people that John talked to you about when he said that, like, each day you add to your life is another chance to be happy. The only response we get from government is, like, we get two things. There's either a ceiling or a floor. I'll deal with the ceiling later under a different heading, but the floor is that, like, if it's worse, if you're suffering from PTSD, it will just be more suffering. We'd say, firstly, when their response to our POI on this issue was, we don't condone suicide, I think that contradicts their case. Their case is effectively suicide. Their case says, voluntarily choose not to continue living. It would be like me voluntarily choosing not to eat what little food I already do. Like choosing not to do something that will preserve your life is suicide. I think he conceded our entire case. But more importantly, we'd say that for the reason I just told you, PTSD will probably have better therapy to deal with it 500 years from now. And so the other thing we got in terms of like pure material benefits from Gov is like death is a powerful motivator. They have two fields under this. Firstly, it gives us men of ambition, and that's good. And secondly, it creates further altruism. In terms of people of ambition, he was like, look, Cecil Rhodes had a plan, and because he was so young and he knew that like he had to deal with it all in his life, he went and did it. That was a good thing. We'd say maybe it would have been a good thing if Cecil Rhodes had taken an extra 50 years to reflect and not hated black people. But also, we'd say there are good people who just spent all their time and their life was just cut short. Isaac Asimov and George Orwell continued writing novels to the day they died. We'd say those sorts of people will just continue to have production in society. That is a good thing. On this notion of altruism and reconciliation, their response is because there is no harm to waiting, people will, because there's no longer any harm to waiting to reconcile, people will not reconcile. We say that is fine if there is no longer any harm to waiting. We're proud to say that, look, if it means that you can just go on with your life and continue to reflect, we're fine with that happening. Broadly also, we'd say that because the stakes of life are higher, that people will be more likely to reconcile if they take more time to reflect. Finally, on what happens to society. Firstly, we told you that under the status quo which side government wants to protect, society abandons people. The societal expectation is that when you reach a certain age, you aren't supposed to be productive. You're supposed to spend your time perhaps having an enjoyable life playing golf, but broadly willing to die. What we say to people is give it up. You're not 30 anymore. And whether that person is Isaac Asimov or Hugh Hefner, we say it is an affront to their dignity to say, look, just get on and die already. But we'd say that is a bad thing. We'd say even if it is true that people are less productive when they get old, because that is the case right now, we'd say that need not be the case if we take the medicine that side government says is on the table. The final issue in this round, under this issue of society, is social change. Side government said we need to wait for these people to die so that the old ideas can die out. A few things. Firstly, perhaps those old ideas may be changed by the power of new ideas. We'd say the thing is that those old ideas are going to be diluted over time because there are only a certain number of people who were born in the 1960s, who it's an infinite number of people yet to be born who will continue to dilute those ideas that are older as time goes on. But we'd say that even if that weren't true, even if the societal effects were as they said, we say it is fundamentally immoral to count on people to die in order to achieve your vision of what a society ought to be like. We say that is an affront to human dignity. That is the reason why we say that people are playing God when they use murder as a means to achieve their ends. We'd say that trying to convince people to commit suicide is tantamount to the exact same thing. Side government hates us all. We proudly do.
What a mediocre speech. I love you, Sean.
And that's a tournament president.
Madam Speaker, I don't hate you all. I just hate people who can't wear a teal tie properly. I think that this round has really boiled down to two major themes that I'd like to talk about. I'm going to address the burden that Sean put on me in doing it. So what constitutes a better life, Madam Speaker? I think Wudi and I both talked to you about how there's essentially like a happiness ceiling that exists in humanity. And just extending that happiness over longer periods of time never really improves that happiness at the end of the day. But there is an unlimited potential for bad things to happen. And if you suffer from something like PTSD that Wudi give you an example of, we think that that's one of these harms in these scenarios. Now the analysis we get out from Sean is that if you're alive longer, you get to say cooler things happen in humanity, like they're eventually going to cure cancer and you want to be around to see that. But we think that's a real hypothetical. You could also be around alive enough to see humanity torn apart by war. I can't guarantee either scenario. But we think at the end of the day, you are going to be a fundamentally unchanging actor in this role. Your values, your ideas aren't going to change over time as humanity changes around you. And I think this kind of ignored my blank slate analysis about passing the torch on to the next generation. I think Wudi and I both talked to you extensively about motivation and how death motivates you to accomplish more. And sure, we might get the rare exceptions like Isaac Asimov who write books until the day they die. But I think at the end of the day, the impact of the books of Isaac Asimov or the works of Shakespeare is that he only got to write so many. It's a quality versus quantity argument, Madam Speaker. I think it's impactful that their reach was limited and they could throw the torch and inspire the next generation who are able to perpetuate the values that I told you about when they are the blank slate and when you have these entrenched values that are never going to go away over time. And talking about the second theme, in driving society forward, I think we told you that individual complacency kicks in and people won't accomplish as much if they have way more time to dwell on a decision. We heard that they got to weigh options better and make better decisions. But are they better, or are you just taking longer to make the exact same decision? I know for some of my friends, the victory lap they took in high school didn't help them a heck of a lot to deciding what their career would be down the road. We think we want you to learn from the consequences of your decisions, and we value that as a society. We want you to learn from those experiences and be incentivized to make better ones or adjust your life accordingly in learning from that process. We think that's what we stand for. And we gave you this excellent point, we think, on a mechanism for social change and how it comes from the next generation who grows up essentially as a blank slate. And they get to have different values than I'm ever going to be able to alter mine to. And we never really heard, we said that some of these instances of people, for example, sacrificing their lives for freedom in Libya right now could just be an instance of a rash decisions. But we say it's beyond an individual concern in that scenario. We think this is a scenario of people putting others' interests at heart in relation to my altruism point. When you're less likely to live as long, you can make a more rational calculus to benefit that next generation, to be altruistic, and to benefit humanity as a whole. For those reasons, we're very proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
Outstanding debate. I invite them to cross the floor and shake hands. And be proud of yourselves.